I'm just really, really pleased to be giving this talk to the people that it really matters the most to, since many of you are my neighbors and friends and walk by these buildings every single day. So many of you probably remember in 2018 that the Museum of the City of New York had a special exhibition on Rosario Candela. As an architecture student, I had always wanted to live in a Candela building. And I was thrilled when I discovered that 865 West End, where I moved after college, was designed by Rosario Candela. I did not know that when I moved in. And in fact, when I moved in, he was not yet a household name. So he would not have been some of the marketing material in order to attract people to the building. When the exhibition came out in 2018, I rushed to see it and I was chagrined. Granted, his finest buildings, the palaces in the sky, the really legendary buildings, are all located on the east side, on the Upper East Side. But I was truly irked that the word West did not even appear in the text for this exhibition, except to indicate where some of the windows in the buildings were facing. I went home and did a quick search online, the top 10 buildings by Rosario Candela. And here they are: Fifth Avenue, Fifth Avenue, Park Avenue, Park Avenue, Park Avenue, Park Avenue, Sutton Place South, East 80th, East 72nd Street, and East 67th. So I just kind of, wait a minute, what's going on here? What's wrong with the Upper West Side? So I met with Andra Moss, who is one of the directors at Landmark West, and we resolved to correct the situation. And I presented a talk on the Upper West Side buildings of Rosario Candela. He began his career on the Upper West Side. He cut his teeth, so to speak, on the Upper West Side. And those buildings that were so highlighted in the exhibition could not have existed without his work here. So I gave a talk on Rosario Candela for Landmark West, and it snowballed. It was so popular, we had to give it 3 times, which was very gratifying, not only because of the work I put into it, but because I really wanted his work on the West Side to be acknowledged. So let's go. First of all, was Rosario Candela really all that? And if you do a quick search online, you'll see that it's not unique that people think, meet the mastermind of the world's most valuable apartments. This guy really seemed to have something going for him. But in order to appreciate Rosario Candela, we need to go back in time a little bit more than that. I just want to touch on where the Upper West Side originally came from. For centuries, the area up here was known as Bloomingdale. You probably all know that. After 1879, when the 9th Avenue L cut through up on Columbus Avenue, serious development finally began happening up in our corner of Manhattan. And there was a lot of concern because it was just developers having a free hand to build whatever they wanted to build. Here is a photo, an example of some of the buildings that shot up right after the L was constructed, and they were typical of tenements going up everywhere else. Architecture critics, government officials, concerned neighbors and residents all were hoping that on the West Side, maybe we could get it right this time and not have a repeat of those miles and miles and miles of tenement buildings that the East Side was covered with, the East Side having been developed much earlier. And at that time, the neighborhood was known as the West End. Bloomingdale encompassed too large an area, and they tried to spiffy it up a little bit by changing the name of the area to the West End. So around the train stations, the L stations, you saw a lot of those tenements going up until pressure sort of reacted against them. But as you got further west, development was of a very different nature, particularly west of Broadway. West End Avenue and that area, you see a lot of very high-end townhouses. They were charming, they were significant, they were expensive, and the West End, particularly west of Broadway, acquired cachet and a sense of place that was sorely lacking elsewhere in the city. So West End Avenue in particular saw high-end luxury townhomes developing, whereas on Riverside Drive, it was intended more for freestanding mansions and large row houses that were comparable to mansions. And on Broadway, even though this was unexpected, the Boulevard, as it was called then, began to develop into a very Parisian appearing street with preferably very large palatial blocks of what they called French flats with commercial space on the ground floor. And here and there in the spots in between, respectable multifamilies were built as infill housing, and these multifamilies were built to look like row houses. These are two apartment buildings, low-rise apartment buildings right across the street from my building on 102nd Street. This is what you saw, a development of tenement buildings around Columbus Avenue off from Central Park West and east of Amsterdam Avenue, then low-rise French flats, multifamily buildings, and gracious, expensive townhouses the further west you went, finished with mansions and freestanding villas on Riverside Drive. Apartment houses, French flats as they were called, had become respectable by this point. So it was becoming acceptable to live in an apartment building. It did not have the negative connotations any longer. And the Saint-Andoche, or the Standoche, as I've heard it called, was reported on brilliantly by Caitlin Hawk a few months ago, and I enjoyed that talk so much. So I recommend that you look into that and learn more about the amazing story of that building. This happens to be right across the street from my building. But these higher rise, let's say, but still low-rise apartment houses culminated in the Alamar at West End Avenue and 105th Street. This building, which is still standing, although not as grand as it once was a superb West End apartment house, French flat, with 2 apartments per floor, and the central courtyard that was landscaped with fountains, and I heard that there were even seals swimming in the fountain, although that may be apocryphal. But anyway, it got that good. So you did not need to live in a row house, especially if your lifestyle did not favor that style of living. Maybe you didn't have a large family, or you weren't in the city that often, and so an apartment worked better for you. Here's an example of a lesser building, West End Hall on the corner of 101st Street, 1905. So it was not, the West End was not just for the super rich. The people who lived in this building were successful, prosperous merchants, professional people, but they had to work for a living. They weren't independently wealthy, but they still lived in very grand apartments. The apartments in buildings like this were laid out to resemble brownstone layouts. So people felt at home in them, and they didn't feel like they were giving anything up other than the exorbitant expense of maintaining a household of servants and just the costs associated with a private home. That all changed in 1905 when the Stanley Court was built. This is the first high-rise building constructed on West End Avenue. It's still there on the corner of 106th Street. Parts of it are missing now, unfortunately, and it's not as grand inside as it once was. I'm just basically reading the marketing here. 12-story, steel frame, absolutely fireproof. The house, 2 apartments per floor. I'm sure that's not the case anymore. Each apartment containing 10 rooms and 3 baths. All living rooms and sleeping rooms were on the outside of the building. There was mail chute, garbage closets, long distance telephone, and electric call bells all included. And the rent was $2,520 per apartment per year, which was more expensive than you think it was, but still not remotely what you would pay for one of those apartments today. Charles Burge was the architect. And I just want to touch very briefly on the layout, the floor plan of the Stanley. This is the ground floor, so you may notice the fact that there's no kitchens in these apartments. On the ground floor, in order to make space for the lobby, the kitchens were in the basement. All the other apartments would have had the kitchens here where the vestibule is located now. But Burge was experimenting with a new style of apartment layout. Up until around this time, apartments were basically laid out room after room after room off of a spine of a hallway. And even in the Dakota, if you've ever been in any of those apartments, it's just basically a long hallway with doors off of that hallway. And that was considered good enough. But by the early 1900s, people were beginning to try to make the apartments feel less like a row of rooms and more like a home unto themselves. And if you notice here, if you can see my cursor, you would walk in from, in this case, the lobby, but upstairs from the landing, into a grand reception room. And all of the rooms opened up off of this central foyer, off of this reception room. Now, we're not quite there yet. This is called the off the foyer plan. We're not quite there yet simply because the bedrooms, or at least one of the bedrooms, still opens off of the entrance foyer. If Burge had just simply built a wall right across here, then he would have had an entrance foyer, and then the bedrooms would have had a private hallway off of them, but he would have lost this large reception area space. So we're verging on the off the foyer plan. And why am I talking so much about this? It's significant because it was one of Rosario Candela's signatures. And speak of the devil, here he is. We know very little about him, in fact. He was born in Montelepre, provincia di Palermo, in Sicily, on March 7th, 1880. He was the oldest boy in the family, and shortly after he was born, the family moved from Sicily to Tunisia. He went back to Sicily to get his schooling, and the family emigrated to the United States in 1906. He remained behind to finish his education in Palermo and came to the United States in 1909. His father's name was Michele, who lived from 1865 to 1942. So he lived to see Rosario achieve the pinnacle of his success. And he was a baker with a shop on 61st Street and First Avenue. Rosario spoke Italian, French, Greek, Arabic, and English, all of them fluently. As a Sicilian immigrant, he was an extremely unlikely candidate for the School of Architecture at Columbia University. But he was accepted, and he must have stuck out like a sore thumb, but he did not doubt for 1 second his own worth. Family legend says that he roped off his drafting table in school to keep his fellow students from stealing his ideas. So he knew that he was on the ball. Another legend also says that his uncles pooled their resources in order to pay for his schooling at Columbia because they all recognized that they were dealing with an extraordinary talent here. Now, these are stories that I heard from his first grandchild, Patty Candela McLeod, who's right here. This is a photo of her and her niece, Rosario's great-granddaughter, at the opening of the Candela exhibit at the Museum of the City of New York. Patty was the only one of the Candela grandchildren who knew him. Some of her siblings were born just before he died and some of them after he died. So she actually knew him. One of her favorite memories of Candela was going upstairs with him to his studio on Sunday afternoons while the rest of the family had cocktails. And she would watch him demolish the Sunday Times crossword and the double cross-stick puzzles in ink in simply the time it took for him to print out the answers. This man was very, very smart. His nickname for Patty was Principessa, which means princess. And here's a photo of him with his wife, Felicia, whose maiden name was Sberna. She ruled the roost. He was quiet, soft-spoken, emotionally distant, and happy to sit back and enjoy the company of his family. He was not a demonstrative man. He also smoked very heavily, according to Patricia. You see there's in the photo, there he is with a cigarette in his hand. She says that she remembers him smoking 3 packs of Lucky Strikes a day. And she also says that the index of his right hand, uh, he couldn't bend it. It always stuck straight out. And we wondered if that was because of his smoking habit and his finger just locked into place, or perhaps, and more likely, it was because of all the drafting he did as an architect. This was long before blueprints were drawn by computer. Every line, every measurement had to be done by hand. He graduated from Columbia in 1915, and he apprenticed with another iconic Upper West Side architect, Gaetan Ajello. Now let's talk about Ajello for just a brief moment. He designed 38 buildings in his 20-year career, not all of them, but most of them on the Upper West Side. He was also a Sicilian immigrant who came directly from Palermo, and he emigrated to the States in 1902. In 1912, he began a prolific collaboration with the Paterno Brothers, who continued an apartment development company founded by their father, Giuseppe. If you hear the name Paterno, you can't help but think of the Upper West Side, the Bloomingdale blocks, and Morningside Heights, because everywhere you look, there are buildings built, financed by the Paternos. Now, just to make sure that we're clear about this, Ajello designed them, Candela designed them, but they did not pay for them. The Paternos were the developers who hired the architects to design the buildings for them. It's important that you understand that in case you didn't. I also included photos of 2 of Ajello's signatures in his buildings. One, almost every one of his buildings has his name carved into the cornerstone. This is at 895 West End Avenue. Gaetan Ajello, architect. They don't all have this, but most of them do. And if you wander around the blocks in the Bloomingdale area, you will see a number of Ajello buildings. Another signature of Ajello's was that he designed the lobbies with a grand staircase, a sweeping staircase, to make it feel more as if you entered a private home. And he always strove to have the doors to the elevators out of sight of the main entrance, so you wouldn't feel as much that you were walking into an apartment building. This stunning stained glass window. Ajello trained as an architect in Italy, so his buildings have a very distinct look to them. Once you've spotted a few of them, you can't miss his buildings. They're very Italian looking. He trained in what was being constructed in major Italian urban centers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And so his style was very, very much what you see on blocks and blocks and blocks in Rome and Milano and Naples and major Italian centers. He recognized Rosario Candela's genius immediately, and he took him under his wing. When Rosario graduated from Columbia University in 1915, he went to work for Gaetan Ajello. And it was under Ajello's tutelage that he met somebody who would be extremely important to him, Gaetan Ajello's major mentor or patron, sponsor, Joseph Paterno. Now, the Paternos are a very interesting family in themselves. There was Giuseppe or Joseph Paterno Sr., then there was Joe Paterno, his brother Charles or Carlo Paterno. There was also Michael and Anthony Paterno, and they all commissioned Ajello to do work for them. Then there was Anthony Campagna and his brother Armino. Both of them married Paterno girls. And then another important Paterno, Familia Paterno marry-in is Raffaello or Ralph Chiluzzi, who married, here's a photo of him with Teresa Paterno. So I hope you're picking up on the pattern that has established here. When I call this La Familia Paterno, I'm serious. Joe here in the center and Anthony Campagna would be particularly important to Rosario because they commissioned him to design his first individual large-scale commission, which is the Clayton. at 215 West 92nd Street. This is on the corner of Broadway, obviously. And it's still standing there today. It's in quite good shape considering it's approaching its centenary. And the owners of this building have taken very good care of it over the years. One of the things I want to point out to you is that very Italian entrance. Through the 1920s, Candela started scaling down a little bit and Americanizing his buildings a bit more than at first. This building has very strong Italian Renaissance accents to it, as would be expected considering that he apprenticed with Ajello. And when I first gave this presentation for Landmark West, the residents of this building were all very proud that there was a C for Candela over the front door. Wrong. The C is for Clayton. And they were very disappointed by that. Ajello also places cartouches with the initials of the developer over the doors of almost all of his buildings. And Candela was very wont to do that as well. But the C is not for Candela, it's for Clayton. But I wanted you to see some photos of the inside of this building because this is going to look very familiar. As you wander through Candela buildings, you see definite signatures inside his lobbies too. Now bear in mind, this is his first major commission. And it's already a very mature style. He worked with Ajello for 7 years at this point, and he acquired some of Ajello's feel for the lobby. And in an apartment building, the lobby says a lot about the building. You'll see Tennessee pink marble, travertine marble, and black Portoro marble in almost all of his lobbies. Coffered ceilings was also one of his signatures, but just because you see all of these things in a lobby does not necessarily mean they were designed by Candela. He was part of a whole cadre of architects who are all working in the same forms and with the same vocabularies. We'll talk about what makes Candela's buildings special in a moment. First, I just wanted you to enjoy the lobby of his very first apartment building. And then upstairs, this I like to think of as a signature mosaic pattern on the floor. I have the same pattern here in my building, but Candela did not use it in all of his buildings, and I do not know for a fact that only Candela used this pattern. Remember, a lot of the features that you see in buildings depend on the budget, what the developer was willing to pay for things. But this is his first building, and this mosaic pattern does show up in a lot of his buildings. What does not show up is the original wood graining on the doors. When I told you that Clayton took good care of this building, I meant it. I would be willing to bet money that all Candela buildings designed in the 1920s had these wood grain, these faux wood doors. But this is the only building I'm aware of where they have been preserved and preserved so beautifully as well. My front door is painted, and it probably looked like this when it was brand new. Now here he is. This is a photo of him taken in 1943. And what makes Candela special? What is his signature? It's not how the building looks. It's not the materials he used, because you'll see these same materials in buildings all over the Upper West Side and elsewhere in the city where luxury apartment buildings were being built in the 1920s. His kind of contribution, and it's an important one, was that he refined the off-the-foyer apartment layout, which was essentially developed a decade earlier by another iconic architect, James Carpenter, who worked mostly on the Upper East Side. These are Candela's words specifically. He wrote this: "An apartment accepting a one-room unit is composed of two well-defined sections depending on which of the 24 hours of one's daily life it is used, the living quarters and the sleeping quarters. And in the case of luxurious apartments, a third one, the service quarters. An ideal apartment, regardless of its size, must have these 2 or 3 sections segregated, not infringing on each other, and easily connected to one another, with the living section nearest to the entrances." If you live in a Candela building, you will recognize exactly what I'm saying. He zoned the apartments in such a way that the living area and the sleeping area and the service area were all distinct and separate from each other. Even in a one-bedroom apartment without a dining room, he still manages to make these apartments feel like houses. Other things to look for in a Candela apartment, but again, I'm going to stress, none of these are unique to him. He did not invent any of these. It's just the question of how he combined them all that makes his apartments so much more desirable. He tried to put windows in kitchens, bathrooms, and public corridors. External fire escapes are rare, and when they do exist at all, they never impinge on a building's appearance. If you see an external fire escape on the facade of a Candela building, it was added after the fact, when the apartments were made smaller and additional fire escapes were needed. When the budget and specs allowed, he tried to assure that an apartment's entrance would always be within sight of a window. So when you walked in the front door of an apartment, he wanted you to be able to see a window and not just stare at a blank wall. He was famous for making his walls thicker so that he could hide plumbing and electrical chases internally. He lowered the radiators so windows were larger and closer to the floor. And as I said, his lobbies tended to be opulent with Tennessee pink, travertine and Port Doral marbles and decorative plasterwork and leaded glass. He also, just like Ajello, tried to keep the elevator doors out of sight of the main lobby, but rather than have a grand staircase the way Ajello did, he shut the stairs off as well. So when you walk into a Candela lobby, you're in the lobby. You don't feel that you're in a transitional space. You feel that you are in a self-standing space. There's no grand staircase bringing you upstairs in a Candela building. So it's just important that you understand that none of this is unique to him. It's, as I like to say, it's not that his buildings were different, they were simply better. And many people say they're the best. So here we go, Candela Corners. This was a term I came up with rather glibly when I first gave my talk for Landmark West, because I realized that here in this string from about 102nd Street to 105th Street, there are 8 buildings that he either designed or was involved in the design of when he was working for Ajello. And I don't know of anywhere else in the city of New York where this many separate, freestanding, independent buildings are right next to each other, contiguous, the way they are here, right on our block. And I'll illustrate that point. Here is a Bromley map of our neighborhood in 1930. And when I talk about Candela Corners, I mean specifically the areas abutting 103rd and West End Avenue. The first building to go up in this area was the Monton in 895 West End Avenue, designed in 1912 by Gaetan Ajello. Now, this is the one building that Candela would not have been associated with in any way because he was still in Colombia when this building was going up. This was the first of the grand apartment buildings to go up in our specific area. 3 years later, Ajello designed 885 right next door. And this is right on the corner of 103rd. In 1916, 905 went up on the other side of 104th Street. And there it is. This building sadly has lost its cornice, and you can see just by looking at it. I remember when this cornice came down, I'm sorry to say, but it looks like somebody with a really bad haircut. 884 West End, 1919 to 1920. Candela was already working with Ajello for 5 years at this point. This is on the northeast corner of 103rd Street. This is an interesting building for Ajello because it's much more plain than most of his buildings. And this might just have to do with the fact that the developer may have been overextended at this point and did not want to spend the usual amount of money Ajello liked to spend on facade details. This is an anachronism in Ajello's work. Then there's 915 West End Avenue. A little bit more to say about this, but this is Candela's first building on West End Avenue, and it's actually his second building anywhere. So this is Candela's second building. And his third building is 878 West End Avenue. An interesting building. We'll talk about this one a little bit more. because it occupies a very small footprint. If you look at these buildings, you can see the size of these 5 buildings are all pretty much the same and occupy about half of the West End Avenue frontage. And 875 has a much smaller footprint. Then 875, a year later, the developer was Ralph Cialuzzi for this one. This is a very grand facade on this building. Cialuzzi spent a lot of money on this building. And then finally, a year later, 865 West End Avenue, developed for Joseph Paterno again. And that's what this building looks like today. And I'll explain why I said today. But you see my point? Candela, the dark green is Candela, the light green is Ajello, with the exception of this one building here. These other 3 buildings, Candela definitely worked on, if for no other reason than being a draftsman on them. Candela Corners. Now, real quick, 915 West End Avenue. On the outside, very much a Candela, as Candela intended it to be. They've done some really good work. This is an older photo on the building. It looks even better than this today. But I'm sorry to say that the inside has not fared as well. By the way, notice the cartouche, JP, Joseph Paterno. When you see a JP, it's Joseph Paterno. When you see an AP, it's Anthony Paterno. An AC, Anthony Campagna. CP, Charles Paterno, etc., etc. So now you know. The current owners of the building took the beautiful classic Candela lobby and really over protests by the occupants, by Landmark West, by landmarks, huge, huge protests were raised, but they decided this looked better. It doesn't. But they did not even want to keep the original Candela ceiling, but luckily they were convinced to at least spare that. All right, I didn't want to talk any more about that. This is one of the Candela apartments in its classic appearance, and this is what they think a Candela apartment should look like. Just to let you know, they're marketing this building as a Candela-designed building. There is maybe 10% Candela left in this building, but the name is magic, even though they have almost totally obliterated his presence in this building. In case you didn't figure this out, I think this is bad. So let's move to 878 West End Avenue, that building I pointed out to you on that small footprint. These are the buildings that were standing on that lot when the package was assembled by Cialuzzi. These 2 brownstones here are still standing today, as is this one on 103rd Street. So it's 1, 2, 3 were torn down in 1922 and replaced by this building, 878 West End Avenue, a very Florentine-looking Renaissance-style building. This is a little atypical for Candela. It's his 3rd building because this has the strongest Italianate doorway of any of Candela's buildings I've ever seen. Some really beautiful carving on it, that rope turning, molding around the outside, a very Tuscan-looking doorway. And it's very monumental. I waited for somebody to walk in the entrance of the building so that you could see how delicately scaled this doorway is. It looks colossal. It looks Roman. It looks like the Colosseum until somebody stands right in front of it and you realize Candela really nailed it with his details on this building. And there is the C for Cialuzzi. Cialuzzi was paying for this building, not Candela, and Cialuzzi was going to have his initial on the front door. Quick touch on the floor plan of the building. This is one of the typical upper floors. The elevators open onto a public hallway, and then each one of the 4 units, these are small units. These are not grand apartments. The building's not big enough for that. But each unit has a foyer, and when you walk into D, there's the window. When you walk into B, there's the window. When you walk into A, there's the window. Only in C do you have to step into the foyer in order to look out of the windows. I mean, it can't always be helped. But he is definitely working from an off the foyer plan, even with a simple, relatively simple 1-bedroom plan where you walk in and the kitchen, let's use A. You walk into A, there's the kitchen off to the side. Here's a little hallway leading to a bathroom and a bedroom. The reason I picked A is because you're about to see it, an A apartment. Here is your Tennessee pink marble with travertine and black Portoro on the floor and the coffered ceiling again. Remember, I showed you the Clayton. That was building number 1. This is building number 3. So he's still working from that bag of tricks at this point. This is the foyer, the vestibule of the lobby. We haven't actually entered the lobby itself yet. Now we're in the lobby. Do you see the resemblances? Do you see how these buildings are related to one another? And Candela always tried to have windows leaded so that you wouldn't just be staring at brick walls, frosted or stained and leaded windows, but you could open these windows and have fresh air circulation in the building in those hot summer months. This is pre-air conditioning, don't forget. The elevator's off to the side, so you don't see it when you first walk into the building. A Candela signature whenever he could make that happen. Travertine floor, Portoro marble details. As I said, here's one of those leaded glass windows. This building is in wonderful condition. I applaud the owners of 878 West End Avenue for taking such good care of their building. It's a co-op, obviously. Here's one of the lobbies, the vestibule's up in the air. Now, right away, here's a different floor. Chiluzzi didn't want to spend the money on what I call that Persian rug floor. So this mosaic floor is just simply less expensive, but it's still nice and easy to maintain. Walking into an A-line apartment, you step into a little foyer, coat closet here, and there are the windows right in front of you. So you step into a space with natural light in it. I'm standing now with my back to the windows. Here's the entrance here. You see that there's a certain amount of symmetry to this wall. The entrance to the kitchen is not going to be as grand as the public entrance, but you still see that the doorways are arranged in a way that's aesthetically pleasing. The kitchen is fun because these are the original cabinets, and I made sure to take a snapshot of this. So you can see, again, he didn't design special cabinets. All the buildings going up at this time had these cabinets. They're very good quality cabinets, and they're almost 100 years old and still working just fine. Nowadays, we call this a crisper, but at my very first presentation of my Candela talk, Andrew Alpern, the writer of the Candela Bible, corrected me. This is actually a sanitary garbage closet. This is vented to the outside and designed to hold trash in a special bucket. I know, I was just as surprised as you probably all are right now yourselves. People use them as crispers. Today, people dispose of trash in different ways than they used to, but this is a garbage closet. Down this little hallway that I pointed out to you before with the bathroom at the end of the hallway. One criticism I have of Rosario is that I personally don't like to see a toilet when I first walk into a bathroom, but I mean, you can just do so much in a limited space. And of course, these details, you will see these in every building built in the 1920s. Candela did not invent the crystal doorknob, but they're wonderful. These are very good quality. When you turn one of these, you can feel how large the knob is, and the brass is very heavy on them. So he's buying better quality materials. Let's scoot over to 875, right across the street. I was particularly eager to get into this building because I wanted you to ooh and ah over the lobby of this building. This is building number 6. So he now has 5 very successful apartment designs behind him. Ralph Chiluzzi designed this, paid for this building as well, but he put a lot more money into this building. He obviously was feeling flush in 1924. And there's the ad for the building, the house with 1,500 windows, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 rooms. This was catering to a broader market base than 878, which had 3 one-bedrooms and 1 two-bedroom per floor. So Chiluzzi was going for a higher-end client at this point. Not to say that 878 was cheap. That was still high-end housing, but this is just higher-end. I just want you to see the puzzle that Candela came up with for these floor plans. 7 apartments in this wonderful jigsaw puzzle where each one of them has a foyer. Each one of them opens into a living room with windows. Every kitchen has windows. Every maid's room, of course, has windows. The bathrooms have windows. He's got it. He's got it by this point. He's doing that wonderful Candela thing where you just feel you step into a gracious space, even in the 3-room apartment, which I have the pleasure of being in. But check out this lobby. This has Ajello written all over it. This is an homage to his mentor, who actually retired from architecture just 2 years after this and moved back to Italy for a while. So I even wonder if Ajello may have had a hand in this design, because it is so Ajello, with the really, really lush use of the black Portoro marble and these wonderful stained glass windows, which frankly in 1924 are a little out of style by this point. You'd expect this in a 1912 building, but not in a 1924 building. But there are so many of them. Now, the day I went in to photograph this building was a horrible rainy day, but you can see, even with the darkness outside, the wonderful feel to this lobby. To me, it reminds me of one of the old motion picture palaces from the 1920s and 30s. This lobby, I mean, this lobby is to die for. It's just really gorgeous, and details everywhere you look. And once again, the shareholders of 875, thank you, bless you for taking such good care of this building. So just everybody ogle it for a couple of minutes, and we're going to move on. This is some of the original lobby furniture, so you have in mind, you have an idea of what Candela, or possibly Ajello, had in mind and what these lobbies were intended to look like. The lighting, the upturned sconces are modern, but they're very much in keeping with the feel of the building. And that stained glass is just everywhere and gorgeous. And the ceilings, this, by the way, down here, you see this person with an orange jacket on, is the front door. This lobby's huge. It's enormous. There, I've just proven my point. And here, you're going to see a pair of brass French doors. Here's a detail of them, again with beautiful stained glass in them. These open into the courtyard area, which faces south. So Candela intended this courtyard to be used by the residents of the building as a little separate outdoor ground level sort of garden area. It is used as such, but I don't think people embrace this idea as much as he had hoped they would. You don't see this in his later buildings. Here's a detail of one of the apartments, the beautiful white oak floors in them. Again, you'll notice that the woodwork here is wood, just the way it was at 878. This was the choice of the owner of the unit. They both chose to strip the paint off of their doors. In 1924, these doors were not intended to be stained. By 1924, the mode was to have painted doors. And so this wood is not fine hardwood. It's hickory or poplar or something like that, but it takes the stain very nicely, as you can see. It's not walnut, it's not mahogany, it's not cherry, but it looks great if that's what you want your doors to look like. I also want you to just admire the complexity of the basement in a building like this. This is a huge building, and all of those apartments have to have all the support systems running through them. Now, of course, this has been updated through the years, but this is something Candela had to understand as well. He probably had a specialist in what we would call HVAC today, working with him, but he could have walked into this basement and looked at each one of those pipes and known exactly what each one of them was for, even if he didn't lay it out himself. The man was just really on top of everything. Here is a very simple 3-room apartment, which I snapped because I wanted you to see that garbage closet with the door missing, so you could see what it looks like inside in case you've never seen one of these. There are vents on the back of it so that the garbage wouldn't stink up the kitchen, quite simply, and then you could keep it in an enclosed space, which I suppose was in order to prevent vermin. I also wanted you to see an original 1924 bathroom. Again, Candela only spec'd the same sort of fixtures everybody else was spec'ing. So they're not marble walls and solid gold fixtures and all this sort of thing. Later on the Upper East Side, that may have been the case. But here, it's not about what he used, it's about how he used it and how he made all the parts of the puzzle come together. I also wanted to share some really funky tile work with you. If you've ever cut and laid tile, this to me, I just cracked up when I saw this. This funny 90-degree cut here, and then here you've got this little elbow cut out of this square tile. Somebody went through a lot of trouble to make these really odd cuts in this tile work. I like to think it was his cousin Vinny who cut these in the afternoon after troppo vino for lunch. And here's another example of really precise but very odd tile cutting. So I had to share that with you. Here's an example of an exterior fire escape, but as I said, not on the facade. This is in the interior courtyard where it would not be seen from the street. Even the doorknobs, heavy-duty bronze doorknobs. People would not walk up and say, oh, wow, look at that heavy-duty bronze doorknob. But if they were ringing that doorbell and waiting for somebody to answer, they would be aware that this was just a chintzy brass doorknob. They would know that. So money was spent on these buildings. And then here is the facade. And once again, I was nearly booed out of the building when I explained to them that RC did not stand for Rosario Candela. It stood for Ralph Chiluzzi. 865, my building. Take a good look at this photograph because this was taken in 1925, right when the building opened. Notice balconettes running across here and a course line. And then you can't see in this photo, but wonderful, gracious detailing in these double-story archways. All gone today. And we'll talk about that very briefly too. But here's the entrance to 865. And Joe Paterno was so proud of this building. Not only did he have his initials on the cartouche over the front door, but on the wonderful ironwork as well. Candela, by 1925, had become enamored with early American architecture. And 865 and a building he designed just prior to this one on 114th Street, Riverside Drive, are built in a blend of Georgian and federal architecture. Of particular significance at 865 is this is the earliest Candela building I found that has a purpose-built penthouse on the roof. Condé Nast's penthouse was being developed just as Candela was drawing the plans for 865, and Condé Nast's penthouse was the first chic, fashionable penthouse in New York City. Prior to that time, penthouses were used for servants and laundry, and all of a sudden they became the place you wanted to be. 865 West End Avenue, to my knowledge, is Candela's first purpose-designed penthouse and one of the very first penthouses built on any apartment building for dwelling, as a domicile on the Upper West Side. When you walk into the lobby, you see differences right away. This isn't dripping stained glass. This isn't dripping marble everywhere you look. It's simpler. It's more American looking. There's still the Tennessee pink marble, but the floor is a combination of crushed stone, what we call terrazzo. Still expensive, still a lot of work to make this, but it's not travertine anymore. You don't see the marble in this building that you see elsewhere. He's going with a different look. He's becoming more Americanized. This is the sort of detail you would expect to see in Monticello or Mount Vernon or someplace like that. So he's gone American. This is his 13th building, by the way. Candela is going with a signature of 3 windows opening onto the courtyards. These windows would have been frosted leaded glass, and when I moved into the building, they were. Clearly, they no longer are. I just want to say right now, this building has been horribly abused. This building has a history of benign neglect going back at least to the 1960s, and it shows everywhere. The landlord has no clue who Candela is or what kind of a treasure he's sitting on. And all I want to say is that this building has been mutilated and neglected to the point where it's only because the building was so well built to begin with that there aren't more problems with it than there are. I want to talk about the floor plan at 865 because this represents Candela in his maturity. 5 apartments per floor, dining rooms in all of the apartments. Even though Paterno went with a simpler lobby in this building, he was definitely targeting an upscale renter for this building. And I'll show you what I mean. Here in this sort of orangey tan color is the public corridor on a typical floor. You see how elegantly it's laid out, with a open staircase with a window on one end and another staircase with a window towards the middle. And then passenger elevator, so they really are handling the two sides of the building, and then a freight elevator as well. And then in this sort of mustard color are the two fire stairs, which are, of course, completely closed off without windows, as code would have required in 1925. In the apartments themselves, each one of them has a foyer, a foyer, an entry area indicated by this pink color. The sizes vary depending on the layouts and the sizes of the units, but each one of them has this. And each one of them, when you step into that foyer, you see a window. You see a window. You see a window. You see a window. You see a window, even if it's at the end of a long corridor. Also, the mustard here indicates the interior hallways. You don't have these endless long hallways that you saw even just 10 years prior to this. The hallways are clipped. They're shortened. They're kept as short as possible. And so you have larger living spaces. And the way the apartments flow, they feel like a home. Now, the occupant of one of the A-line apartments, which is the largest in the building, has graciously permitted me to enter their apartment. And so I can show you how this all feels in real life. Here is the front door to the building, which will be located right here on the floor plan where the A is indicated. Right next to it is the enclosed fire stair. You walk through the front door and you enter this long hallway. And this window here is this window on the floor plan, just so that you're orientated correctly. Walk down that vestibule and you come into a space that's large enough to be a small room in and of itself. The occupants of this apartment have made it into a library, and it's a very comfortable space to receive guests and to just sit in a comfortable chair and read books. But you have a spacious dining room and a spacious living room opening off of this space as well. Here I am with my back to the door to the kitchen area, looking through the double doors into the living room. There's an error on this floor plan in that the dining room is indicated as not having a pair of French doors here. All of the apartments do have these French doors. And when the doors are closed, you feel like you're in some kind of a wonderful bird cage. Natural light everywhere you look. Spacious rooms. Living room has a really substantial feel to it. It's a large room. You can fit a lot of furniture in it. You can create zones in it. It's really just an elegant, wonderful space in which to sit. And the butler's pantry. If you walk through the dining room, you enter the service corridor. So here you've got the public area. Here you have service. And there's the butler's pantry. These cabinets are 95 years old now and still holding up. The maid's room has a transom window over it so that this way the maid could have cross ventilation on those hot summer's nights. Still, remember, this is pre-air conditioning. And then if you walk through this doorway here, you're in the private area, the bedroom area. 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, and it just has a wonderful feeling of separateness to it. This part of the house is separate from the public part of the house, as you can see. Here is the 1925 bathroom. One thing I want to point out as being kind of funky is that in Candela's specs, he only brought the tiling up around the tub to roughly chest height, although shower heads were part of the original specs. So over the years, the landlord, this is a rental building, has had to tile up to above the shower heads in every apartment because the plaster here was exposed to, I like to say that Joe Paterno must have married off one of his daughters right when he was building this building, and so he was cutting corners. I totally made that up. But he saved a lot of money not putting this tiling in, but in the long run, he invited real maintenance trouble because of that. Here's details of the kind of spec'd bathroom items you would see in any building in 1925, but I just wanted you to see them. And here, this sink, all of the other sinks in this entire building, this is my building, I know this building very well, have a single spigot with faucets on each side. This is the only sink I know of in the building that has two faucets, one for hot, one for cold, with two separate spigots. There's a story here. I don't know what it is. And now here we go, leaving again through this gracious vestibule area. Well, 1929, we all know what happened. Wall Street crash affected Candela very heavily. In 1929, 12 buildings by Candela were under construction. Another 15 were in the drawing plans and about to be have their ground broken. None of those 15 buildings were ever constructed. In 1929, he had 12 buildings going up. From 1930 until 1948, he only designed an additional 7 buildings. The Upper West Side was devastated by the stock market crash. On the East Side, a lot of people didn't have to work for their living. A lot of the Park Avenue and Fifth Avenue people sort of just dug in their heels and waited it out. On the West Side, people were wiped out. Landlords were wiped out. Construction, as you all probably know, pretty much stopped from 1929, with the rare exception until the very late 70s or early 80s, when construction began again, and the Upper West Side sunk into a period of, as I say, not so benign neglect. And 865 West End Avenue is a classic example of that. However, although Candela never worked on the Upper West Side again after 1929, he decided to wait out the Depression with his wife by building a small little shack in Harrison, New York. This was the house he developed in the early 1930s for himself. He did design a few private houses and renovated some apartments, and he also designed a couple of commercial buildings in Manhattan, basically taxpayers, with the exception of the Rialto Theater. Marvelous Art Deco building, really high Art Deco. So it shows that Candela could really master any style. But sadly, that Rialto was demolished in 1999. But his glory days were over. He worked, as I said, very, very infrequently. To keep busy, he served as a visiting design critic for the Beaux-Arts Institute of Design. With a mind like his, he could not remain inactive for long, so he became an expert in the development of cryptograms and codes. And he wrote 2 books on the subject of cryptography. He also taught a class on cryptography at Hunter College for military personnel. And during the war years, he worked secretly in Army intelligence and is said to have been part of the team that broke the Japanese master code. In 1948, he designed his last apartment building with architect Paul Resnick. It was a co-design, 135 East 54th Street. And he was commissioned to do this by his longtime colleague, Anthony Campagna, who had commissioned him to design the Clayton, his very first building. You can see, as far as a post-war building goes, this is rather an exceptional one because it still has some architecture going on in it, but it's just a pale shadow. He retired in 1958, and they moved out of the palace in Harrison, and Candela spent the last years of their lives together in an elegant duplex apartment in Fleetwood in Mount Vernon, where Felicia filled the top floor terraces with blooms. Rosario died on October 6, 1953. At the time of his death, the FBI sealed his studio in the apartment in Fleetwood until all materials of national importance were removed. The Candelas are both buried in Gate of Heaven Cemetery in Hawthorne, New York. Candela was never a household name during his lifetime or even later, but his Upper East Side palaces were always held in high regard by those who could afford them. Architecture critic Paul Goldberger first drew public attention to him in the early 1970s, and he argued that Candela-designed buildings offered a classic New York alternative to the monotonous brick boxes and cold open floor plan buildings that were going up in the post-war. The Upper East Side addresses were almost untouchable, but there were 26 elegant, spacious, comfortable buildings on the reviving Upper West Side, originally designed for upper middle class residents, which were within reach of the pioneers who were returning to the Upper West Side in the 1970s and 1980s. These buildings are now approaching their centenary, but Candela remains a magic word in New York real estate today. For many in the real estate industry, Candela supersedes all other descriptors when trying to market an apartment. And many buildings and layouts are called Candela inspired, even when they predate his body of work. One building on the 500s block of West End Avenue calls itself Candela-designed, even though it was built in 1912, 3 years before he even became an architect. Happily, most of his buildings are now included within landmark districts. We can thank Landmark West for that. Although his first commission, the Clayton, is still currently not protected. So at any rate, we can anticipate the bulk of his work surviving well into the future. This is the Bible, the New York apartment houses of Rosario Candela and James Carpenter. And I'm happy to say that Andrew Alpern came to my first presentation of my much, much, much longer talk. Here are the buildings on the Upper West Side: 1922, 1923, 24, 25, 26. He was working exclusively on the Upper East Side. 27, oops, there's a sole one down there near Lincoln Center. 1928, near Central Park West, and then the bulk of them through 1929. I want to thank all these people: Landmark West, Andrew Moss, Andrew Dolkart, Patty Candela McLeod, Stephen Candela, Andrew Alpern, Margaret and C. Christian Beals, Ruth Helfrich, Marv Schoenberg, Leonard Gottlieb, Jesse Berger, Dale Vanderstand, and most particularly, Rosario Candela. Thank you so much for your patience and attention. If you have questions, I will be happy to answer them.
Anthony, there's more comments in the chats, but one question is, were the entrances always planned to have the awnings as they are today?
I think it's a fair question, and I would say that Candela did not design awnings for the entrances, but that was an absolute standard detail in those days, just as so many of these apartments also had canvas awnings around the windows, because it was just that the awnings are by the doors, the marquees, if you will, designed to keep you dry as you're waiting for a cab. The awnings around windows were to keep the apartments cooler in the summer months.
Okay, well, Anthony, thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thank all of you who have attended. This has just been terrific. And we are going to go on to the Block Association meeting now.